Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. This week was a special episode. I invited my former guest, Chris Cook, back on the show to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Chris is an energy market strategist and he's a senior research fellow at University College London, and he spent the past 15 years researching how to make markets more resilient. I asked him to come back to discuss how Russia's energy dominance in Europe could be used to win this war, if that was possible, how effective sanctions will be against Russia. He explained his experience with the Iranian government and their markets and how sanctions have worked or failed over there. He said the United States' use of sanctions against Iran are tactically very smart but strategic failures. Because unless you're targeting specific people, you're punishing the general population. I think that's key when discussing a nation like Russia, which is known for its oligarchs. There's 25 of them. We have their names. They absolutely run the nation, a lot of geopolitics, the markets, and they abuse and exploit their own nations and their neighbors in order to rake in huge profits for themselves. If you haven't listened to the episode yet, I would highly suggest you go and do that. It was absolutely fascinating to better understand the relationship between energy buyers and suppliers, and also to understand the interaction between economic markets and energy markets, and which all tie in to give a better sense of the geopolitics of this situation. And it surprised me that the conversation went there, but Chris discussed the dominance of the United States. The fact that they weaponize the dollar, the fact that energy markets or oil is priced in USD, and the impact that that's having geopolitically on nations, and then also the impact that that has on markets. And he says it's the end of the United States dominance. And we discussed how perhaps rather than create a vacuum, if you have the market frameworks in place that Chris has been working on to build resilient markets around cooperation and mutuality, then the United States losing its dominance, it could create a vacuum where another nation would step in, or it would provide the opportunity to promote these cooperative mutual markets, which would then provide better services and higher quality of life, decreases sort of the commodification of basic goods and services, but would also provide an opportunity for better geopolitics. If you cut out the middleman and you have markets that are built on transparency and ergo relationships, it's harder to imagine nations invading one another, because they depend on one another. What I say at the end of the episode is, whilst these theories and practices are so exciting, it's very disheartening to realize how much of a stretch of the imagination it is, in still quite a nationalist world, to envision nations depending on one another for mutual survival rather than, oligarchs, networks of oligarchs or capitalists using markets for their own benefit. We've still got a way to go in many respects, but then also Chris gives examples of when these kinds of agreements have been used throughout history. The problem with nationalism and with seeing resilience as fundamental independence, i.e. that a nation can look after its own and doesn't rely on anybody else, is, well, firstly, you get war. And then obviously we will never reach that sense of interdependence, which binds peoples and markets to benefit each other, to help one another, to supply one another with what they need, and reach a sense of cooperation. I think this is quite a difficult conversation to have right now, because certainly in the West, with Putin's terrible, terrible strategy, frankly, he looks like a madman, and he has no sense of care for his own people, and certainly not for the people of Ukraine. But ultimately, what Chris is suggesting would demand that any talks with Russia, whether it's Putin as leader or somebody else, that they also be given the opportunity to join these agreements of mutuality and cooperation. Even though Chris says that that's where we need to go in the future in order to avoid such situations as these, and also economic crises, ecological crises, etc. It's hard to imagine allowing Putin a seat at the table in order to create these mutually reliant frameworks and agreements, given the nature of his actions. Ultimately, those kinds of agreements and frameworks demand a base level of trust, and then will engender and create more and more trust as they're in place. But how do you do that in a world built on nationalism? I suppose we could maybe look to Europe, the countries that came together after the Second World War, who understood that. But surely part of Europe's success has also been the fact that there is a Europe and then there is an outside world. There is an other, to use philosophical terms. If you need to do it on a global scale and you're not therefore using a common enemy to come together against, it demands a sort of blind trust. And I'm sure there would be clauses written into agreements that if X nation broke X part of the framework, then the agreement would be broken. But then also, what would that then do to the theory itself? I don't know. It's a really interesting thought. How do you move, even though Chris says we're already moving into Market 3.0, into cooperation, mutuality, and networks, how do you move from such a capitalist market where the concept of trust has been decimated by what he says middlemen who are out to make profits and out to abuse markets? How do you set up an agreement with a nation like Russia after this invasion, given the loss of lives? He attacked a sovereign country. Do you not forgive that, but do you put faith in our ability to all move forward and to create better agreements for the future? Or do you punish that kind of behavior? Or is there a way that you can do both? I'm very glad I'm not a politician right now. This is a horribly complex and devastating situation. But I think it's really crucial to understand the impact that markets have on the decisions that need to be made, on the events that are currently happening, and therefore also what could happen in the future. I would highly urge you go and listen to the episode with Chris. It was absolutely fascinating. Do let me know what you think of our conversation and also of this little episode. Do leave a comment below and join the debate. And do remember to subscribe if you're new here. If you're not new here and you're enjoying the podcast, you can support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. Thank you to everyone who is supporting the podcast and is part of the Planet Critical community. Thank you all for watching. I hope this was useful in some way, and I will see you next week.